Okay, well, let's make a start and get going on tonight's thing. So first of all, welcome to the BLSI, ladies and gentlemen, on what is quite a busy evening in Bath. And thank you very much for coming along to hear about the World in 2050 series. This is the third talk in the series. So far, we had an overview of the World in 2050 by Hamish McRae. The second talk then was the first deep dive into the economics of the world in 2050. And today is the third talk where we deep dive into climate change. But before we do all of that, I just want to sort of make a couple of admin announcements. The first one is that in all my time at the BLSI, and that's too many years I care to remember, but the fire alarm has never gone off. And I don't think it will go off today, but in case it does, I need you to form an orderly queue, go down the stairs from whence you came up, go through the front door, turn right, and then turn right again and assemble at Chapel Green, just around the corner. So that's really the announcements for the audience online, in the room. Online, just some guidance for you in terms of how to ask questions later on. There's three ways of asking questions after Eunice has finished her talk. That is, one is you can unmute yourself and show the video and ask questions directly of Eunice, and she will answer. The second way is to raise your hand in Zoom electronically, and I shall pick you out and you can ask the question that way. And the third way of asking questions, of course, is putting your questions in the chat room. And then I can pick those out and raise them with Eunice. So this really is just all the admin. Before I introduce Eunice, as I threatened a couple of times, we now go to the poll. And let's hope this works. So everybody ready, online and in the room? 1 second. Okay, so the first question is, climate change is the biggest threat to humanity in 2050. Do you agree or disagree? Oh. Let's keep it going for a couple more seconds. Okay. That is, given everything else that's going on in the world around Ukraine in terms of nuclear disarmament and all the topical news on AI, it still seems as if climate change is one of the biggest issues we do need to solve. So I think I go to the next one. It's 75 to 25. So I think that's pretty compelling. So next question. In 2050, climate change will be A, solved, a bigger problem, or under control. Please vote no. Well, we're trending very much to the sort of similar answer to the first one, but nobody thinks we've solved it, which is a bit depressing. So despite technology improvements, whatever, I think we are going to be under a modicum of trouble under this, under control. A quarter of the people think it's under control. So let's go to the next question. Climate change is best solved, and I know you probably agree with most of these, but please only pick one. Individual change in behavior, government action and legislation, government action and legislation, it's going around documentation, action and legislation, or finally, global policy agreement. So you can see it on your screen. They moved around on the screen for me. So, but please vote which one you think is the most. Okay, well, that's interesting. That's very interesting. So nobody believes it's our individual behavior that would make a difference. Corporates, 10%. And then roughly even split between global policy action and government action and legislation. So that is something, obviously, that Eunice will, I'm sure, touch on in terms of her presentation. Okay, so that's fine. So that's the poll. Keep it open, because we're going to rerun this poll at the end of Eunice's presentation, just to see whether anybody's changed their mind. And we're doing this for every single talk. Obviously, the questions will change depending on the talk, but it will be very interesting to see how opinions change. So, on to the main event. It gives me great pleasure to invite Eunice Lo from the University of Bristol to talk to us about climate and human health. The first deep dive into the non-economic aspects of the World in 2050 series. Climate change and the impact on humanity is fundamental. It's actually quite worrying for most people. And, moving forward in terms of the next 2 decades or so is useful. That's why the World in 2050 series is only gazing out really a generation forward, because we'll have a pretty good idea how that is how it is likely to pan out. We have some background information here. Now, Eunice has spent her whole life really in academia around climate. She graduated with a master in physics and astronomy from Durham. She got her PhD in climate, atmosphere and oceans from the University of Reading in the meteorological department. And she's been at the Bath University since 2017, where she holds the research fellow for climate change and human health at the Cabot Institute. So she has a huge amount of knowledge around climate and human health. And she's also a key contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And she's actually been to COP26 to actually experience the relationship between what science tells us is going to happen and what ultimately politicians and political scientists then do as a result of that. So without further ado, please put your hands together for Eunice Lo.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you for introducing me. I actually prepared to introduce myself, but I don't need to do it anymore. I work at the University of Bristol, and I do research about climate change and health, in particular in relation to extreme weather events in the warming climate. My focus has been on the present day, so we observe what we observe currently, and also how climate models or computers tell us about the future based on our understanding of the physical climate system and what humans do on this system. So I'm going to talk about a few things. So first of all, I'm going to talk about climate change itself. Then I'm going to talk about the health impacts of climate change in terms of what we know already, what we have seen in the real world, and also what we think will happen in the future. So I'm going to start with this graph here. So this is the climate stripes made by Professor Ed Hawkins from the University of Reading. You can go to this website, showyourstripes.info, and you can get these kind of stripes for different places in the world. So what it shows is that on the left-hand side here, you have 1850. So that's the pre-industrial times we talk about a lot in climate science. All the way to the right-hand side here, we have kind of the present day. So it stops in 2020 here because we don't have a full year of 2023 yet. So each color represents the global average temperature of the world that year. A blue color means a cooler year. A red color means a warmer year. So the darker blue it is, the colder it was that year. And the darker red it is, the warmer it was that year, like on average globally. And also the kind of like the lengths of the bars also show the temperature, as in going down means it's warm, it's cooler than the baseline, which I think is around in the 20th century. And above this horizontal line, it goes up, it is like a positive warming effect above the certain baseline that they use. But the overall message here is this is climate change. So we see that from year to year, there's some variation in global temperature because the climate system has a natural component in it. So various things interact with each other there's a natural variability in how the temperature is, just like the weather, whether it's just a shorter term thing, climate is a longer term statistics. We see there's variation in the climate system, but we also see from the past to the present day, the global average temperature has increased, and there's a trend going up, increasing much faster in recent years in the 21st century. And this is the trend we talk about in climate change. Overall, we know that since pre-industrial times, so since the left of this graph, the global average temperature has increased by over 1.2 degrees Celsius. And this is only the temperature when we talk about near the surface, so what we kind of feel all over the globe. If we only talk about land regions, usually this number is higher. So this is what we talk about climate change, and sometimes it's referred to as a hockey stick because it sticks up like towards closer to us. So this is another graph showing similar climate stripes. So again, blue color means a colder year, warm color means relatively a warmer, red color means a relatively warmer year. Now there's also, the color means something here as well. So a blue color is kind of below average year in terms of temperature. A red color is about 2 degrees warmer above average. All the way to purple is 4 degrees warmer above average. So this is a figure taken from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It shows, again, we can see that it turns from blue to slight orange, and then to 2020, which is the gray line here, is orange, and its orange is indicating just about 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So it's similar, so it's the same as what I showed just now. But what this graph adds is the right-hand side bit to this side. So in the future, if we look into the future, we have a choice in what the climate looks like. So on top, there's where it says very high. That represents a scenario in future where greenhouse gas emissions are very high. So this is kind of like, the range we expect in the future, depending on what we do. And in that bar, we can see that towards 2100, so at the end of this century, the color gets deeper and deeper into purple. So the globe warms a lot higher. And then there are 5 different scenarios in this graph. At the bottom, there's a very low emission scenario. And we can still see that actually we expect the climate to warm more than now, but it warms less than a high greenhouse gas emission scenario. So this graph really shows that we have a choice here, and what we do now changes what happens in the future. And what I like about this graph as well is that at the bottom here, you see different generations plotted here. So at the very bottom, for someone who was born in 1950, they will be 70 years old in 2020. In their lifetime, they would have experienced warming, so in kind of like bluish gray color to orange color in their body. But for someone who is born in 2020, so like 2 levels above that, the baby there, when they are born, they are already experiencing about 1.2 degrees warming. When they are 70 years old in the future, in 2090, they could be experiencing any of those colors in that body on the right there. But again, that color, whether it's deep purple or whether that's, orangey red color, depends on what we do now. So this is a problem that concerns nowadays us who are living here right now, but also people who are born right now or who haven't been born yet. So when we talk about climate change, I think, well, as we look at the news, there's plenty of news about weather extreme events happening around the world. And we always get asked this question of, is this heat wave climate change? Is this flood climate change? And I can say that a lot of them are actually, or at least is partly increased because of climate change. So one very prominent example of extreme weather associated with climate change is record-shattering heat waves. I'm highlighting 2 examples here. On the left-hand side is what happened on the 29th of June, 2021 in the Pacific Northwest, like in the Canadian-US border. 49.6 degrees Celsius was recorded in a place called Lytton, and that was breaking the national temperature record by nearly 5 degrees. So it's a massive, it's not just breaking records by a little bit, but like a big amount. And therefore, for people who are not used to that kind of very extreme temperature, nearly 50 degrees. For that particular heat wave, for many major extreme events, scientists can now do a lot of climate simulations pretty much in real time to find out if there's a role played by human effects on the climate system. So how we do it is that we have a lot of, we have climate models that have been built for decades and through, decades of research in different generations. We know these models are trustworthy. We have a scenario in this model that has all the stuff in it. So it has the natural variation in climate, but it also has the human emissions of greenhouse gases and pollution and everything in it. And we run another experiment with the same model that we trust, but this time it only has a natural component in it. So everything from solar radiation cycles, volcanic eruptions and all that, but not the human emissions in it. And we compare the statistics that we see, say, temperature in these two experiments. And we, most of the time, in most of the extreme events, we find completely different likelihood or probability of having that particular heat wave in these experiments. So this is called climate detection and attribution. And by doing these for different events that we know have happened in real life, then we can come up with statements like this. So for the left-hand side, the extreme heat wave in Canada, again, scientists have come up with this conclusion that it was virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. So we're not talking about, is it possible in the natural system? We're talking about it wouldn't have been possible if we didn't put all the emissions into the atmosphere. It wouldn't have possible if it was just natural. So on the right-hand side here is closer to home. I've taken the heat wave in the UK last year. So it was the first time we recorded over 40 degrees Celsius in the UK. So now national record is 40.3 degrees Celsius in Lincolnshire, I think, in July last year. So it was record breaking, and we know that we aren't adapted to high temperatures. Again, similar experiments found that these events would have been extremely unlikely without human-caused climate change. So we know for quite high certainty, actually, that a lot of the heat waves that we have experienced can already be attributed to the human component of the problem, not the natural one. Or, it's a combination of natural because we can't take it out, but also the human part. So I'm also put two examples here about flooding and droughts. So these are, again, two of many examples in the world. On the left-hand side there, it was the flooding in Pakistan, I think a couple of years ago. So that's a picture from the event then. According to reports, this flood affected 33 million people. It destroyed 1.7 million homes. And over 1,500 people lost their lives, maybe more. We don't know because these numbers are sometimes underreported. Rapid studies showed that the heavy rainfall associated with this flooding in Pakistan that year was made about 50 to 75% more intense because of human-caused climate change. On the right-hand side here, in another part of the world, this is now in the Horn of Africa. This is another problem that they have very low rainfalls since I think 2021 onwards. So this is talking about their long rain seasons, which is I think March to May every year, and they have had very low rainfalls. And this have caused massive problems like displacement of people, not having enough crops, not having enough food, etc. Again, these low rainfalls were found to have become about twice as likely because of humans. So I've only given a couple of examples, but I wanted to summarize what I've talked about climate change first before we talk about other impacts. So we know that global average temperature has risen by over 1.2 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. 1.2 degrees Celsius sometimes doesn't sound a lot to some people, but in fact, we are already experiencing some of the consequences of climate change, and it is because of our greenhouse gas emissions. Extreme weather events such as heat wave, floods, droughts, and I haven't talked about wildfires and other storms and other events are made more likely and or more intense because of climate change as well. And the problem is that it is not someone else's problem, it is everyone's problem, because these events can occur everywhere, and indeed we have seen them in many places in the world, and everyone is affected by it. So now I'm going to briefly talk about the health consequences then of climate change. So this is a schematic taken from the WHO, so the World Health Organization. And what I talked previously about the physical climate system and the extreme events are all written in the middle there. So there are different exposure pathways from climate all the way through to health. Extreme weather events being one, exposure to heat being another, the heat waves and how we feel poorly about it, air quality, water quality, food security and safety, and these things kind of link together as well. And also vector-borne diseases are things that can be affected by climate change. On top of that, some people are more vulnerable to these things than other people, and that depends on, for example, whether they have underlying health conditions, whether what their age is, what their socioeconomic background is, and other factors. Another factor that affects people's health in a warming climate is where they live, whether there's a resilient and a health system that has capacity for dealing with all these problems. And that depends on the health system, the leadership, and financing, and everything else. So all of these have impacts, but the health risks that are sensitive to climate are listed at the bottom here. And I think this is quite a nice schematic. So it ranges from injury, maybe, when there's injury and mortality from extreme events, for example, when there's a heat wave and some people decide to go swimming in a river, and then there could be accidents, heat-related illnesses. I know a lot about that because that's my research, what my research is focused on. So that means that our body actually cannot cope with a certain level of heat just because we need a certain level of range of temperature to function in. Other illnesses such as respiratory, waterborne diseases, pandemics, vector-borne diseases, malnutrition, and foodborne diseases because of crops not being able to grow in the places they are used to, livestock not being able to adapt to a changing climate, and so on. And also, increasingly mental health as well. Like if someone sees their house being burnt down in a wildfire, or their house completely flooded, or just anxiety about climate change, which is quite prominent in the younger generation now. There are a load of health issues associated with climate change. And because of all of this, the World Health Organization says this on their website: climate change is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. Between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year, and that's mainly from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. So a range of different things being mentioned here, but the figures are quite alarming, and 2030 and 2050 aren't that far away. But for the rest of this talk, because of my own research and what I'm most comfortable talking about, I'm going to focus on just one example here, because of the limit of time. So I'm only going to focus on heat waves, heat stress, and what it means to our health at the present day and in the future. So here's a graph I took from a paper in the Lancet on the left. You don't really need to read it. I don't really know it actually because I'm not a medical doctor, but it shows all the pathways that heat can affect a human's body. And it's mainly concerned about whether you're able to sweat and evaporate your sweat to cool your body down. And that, if you don't drink enough fluids, then that could link to dehydration and kidney problems and so on. When we are exposed in high temperatures, then our body, including our heart and all our blood vessels, need to work harder to get rid of the heat if it can. And therefore, someone who has underlying, for example, cardiovascular disease could be more vulnerable to heat. But overall, even healthy human beings who are fit and young gets affected by extreme levels of heat when they are exposed in a prolonged exposure as well, because there's a limit that we can survive in terms of temperature. So on the right-hand side here, this is a graph from my own research. It shows what is the mortality risk at different temperatures in London. So this is all based on observed data. So I got data of how temperature was in the last 3 decades or so. I got the daily numbers of mortality in London in the same decades. And then by using statistics and modeling, we can find a relationship between mortality risk of human beings in London and temperature. There's quite a lot of numbers here, but the main thing is that right-hand side here is increasing temperature. Going up the vertical axis is increased mortality risk, and it curves upwards like that. So the higher the temperature, the higher the mortality risk in London. And I found the same in every place in the UK, and my colleagues in other places have found similar effects, not exactly the same, but similar effects in basically most places in the world, this like curved up relationship. It's also important that it's curved. So what it means is that if we go from, say, 20 degrees to 21 degrees, so still quite mild temperature, the increase in mortality risk is quite small. But if we go from 31 to 32 degrees, which is on this side of the graph, also 1 degree increase, but the mortality risk is much larger. So the more extreme the temperature gets, the mortality risk doesn't increase linearly, but exponentially. And that is what's worrying, because we're getting more extreme temperature on this side of the curve. So I'm going to talk about what we know about what has happened in the past in terms of heat waves and health impacts in different places now. So this is a table that I've put in quite a lot of my presentations now, and I know it's quite alarming here. So it lists just a few heat waves that's happened in the past in different places, the year they happened, where, and also the estimated number of mortality associated with that heat wave. So in Chicago in 1995, there was a massive heat wave in July that year, and then hundreds of people died in that heat wave. And this is a picture of someone getting into an ambulance from that time. In 2003, Europe had a massive heat wave affecting the UK as well. And the estimated number of deaths then were 20,000 people. That's across Europe. For England itself, according to Public Health England, it's in the thousands. It's about 2,200 people. Also to note that because that event was so bad, 2003, that the year after, England introduced its heat wave plan for England, which still runs now. In fact, it's being combined with cold weather now, being one single plan for the UK. But so this is an example of adaptation. So in this heat wave plan, it says, Public Health England works with the Met Office where the forecasts come in, and they know to give out alerts of extreme heat, which I think we had a couple of weeks ago, to alert people of the potential dangers of a heat wave coming and what actions they can take to the general public, but also to NHS hospitals and staff of what the staff can do to help their residents and patients through a heat wave. So this is one example of adaptation to climate change, and we have that in place in the UK, England and Wales, and also it's being continually updated and renewed every year. There are other heat waves that happened in the world, actually. In Russia, there was a massive death toll then. And in 2022, which is the new edition that I added for the UK last year, when the 40.3 degrees was recorded for the first time, the number of deaths in heat waves last year was in the order of 3,000 to 4,000. These are in addition to, the mortality that we expect from the summer. So scientists then asked the question, so, when we had a heat wave or flood, we asked the question that was it climate change, or was it made at least worse by climate change? We asked the same question about specific health outcomes associated with certain extreme events. So talking about the 2003 European heat wave, first of all, Peter Stott from the Met Office looked at these events the year after, and they found that human influence on the climate system at least doubled the chances of that heat wave happening compared to a natural world that doesn't have all the greenhouse gases in it. Taking a step further, and this is the state of the art of the science now, we attribute the impacts associated with an extreme event to human-induced climate change, not just the event itself. So, as I said before, I think overall in Europe, there were about 20,000 excess deaths in Europe. And Dan Mitchell from the University of Bristol now attributed that and found that human-induced climate change increased the risk of heat-related mortality. So it's not any mortality, it's just mortality associated with heat in central Paris by 70% and in London by 20%. So Paris had it worse, but also we saw the effects in London, and we knew that part of it was because of human-induced climate change. So that's attributing the physical weather events all the way through to impact to climate change itself. There's a global picture from my collaborator Anna in Switzerland in her paper here. So she looked at all the countries we had data for in the last 3 or 4 decades, I think. And again, she looked at an experiment where there's no human emissions of greenhouse gases and an experiment there is. And she showed that in 1991 to 2018, 37% of summer heat-related mortality can be attributed to human-induced climate change. And that's including all the countries listed here. It's not a global picture because we actually don't have this kind of research done in most places in Africa and the tropics because we have a lack of data there. But for places we can do a study like that, we have. So 37% is the global number, but we can talk about individual countries here. So I'm just reading out of the graph here. For the UK, the number is about 40%. But for a place like Iran, that percentage is about 60%. So how heat is affecting human beings and their health depends obviously on where the people live and also what the infrastructure and the policies there are. And we can make statements like that also about how much of it can be attributed to climate change itself. So here's a summary. I know it's not the most fun talk I'm giving, but this is the reality. There are many pathways through which climate change can affect human health, and that's both physical and mental health. And I personally think mental health isn't talked enough about. Heat waves in particular can have high death tolls. Both the heat wave themselves and also the health impacts have been attributed to the human part of climate change, not the natural part only. And there are many other things I haven't talked about in terms of extreme weather, including floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, diseases that are vector-borne or waterborne, and so on. So this talk is mainly about the world in 2050. So I thought I'll add some of the future climate impacts there as well. So now we're looking into the future after knowing about what climate change is and what the present day situation is. So I do not know why I've put this here again. I'll skip it. Oh, I actually do. I've forgotten. So this graph I've shown before. This is the graph from the UN government intergovernmental panel on climate change about what scenarios we choose in the future. Well, we choose now basically. Will end up in different futures in terms of how global temperatures are. And because we know that the UN body has actually come up with this Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. The Paris Agreement is talked about a lot in the climate science and policy sphere, and also is the main focus on all the COPs. And COPs stand for Conference of the Parties. So different nations or the EU as a whole is a party to this UN body. They all signed these Paris agreements, and the goal of the Paris agreements mainly, it's called the Paris Agreement because it was signed in Paris, but it's a global agreement, and it's about climate change. And the goal mainly is to keep the global average temperature rise in this century to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and also to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees. I started this talk by talking about what climate change is, and at present day, we are 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. So we're edging quite close to that 1.5 degree warming target, and that is the ambitious target in the Paris Agreement. That target is for stabilizing the climate this century. So if we have a temporary overshoot or going above the limits, it kind of isn't the same, but still we kind of want to keep our global average temperature better below 1.5 degrees Celsius, but the other target is 2 degrees Celsius, but we are about 1.2 now. This graph here is also taken from that UN body, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a bit dated now from 2018, but the idea is the same. So this plot is called a burning embers plot. The darker the color, the higher risk it is for that particular thing. So for warm water corals, for example, it's not the focus of this talk, but you can see that the risk transitions to very high risk very early on. And how we read this graph is that at the lower horizontal line is 0 degree warming, and then the gray bar horizontally is about 1 degree warming, which at the time was the present day warming. We're above that now. So the higher you get is how much warming you get globally. And then each bar stands for a different system in the natural world, in the managed world, or in the human system about the risk in this system. So there are many things here, including tourism being not very high risk in a warming world, but again, coral reefs, coastal flooding, the Arctic region being quite high risk transitioning into the future. But it also mentions what I'm talking about here, which is the heat-related morbidity and mortality on the right-hand side here. So this graph shows that it transitions to pretty much no risk, which is white color, to yellow and orange, which is moderate risk in the future. Again, this comes from 2018, so science might have progressed since then. But we know that when we talk about specifically heat and the health consequences associated with it, then we know we have increasing risk as the climate gets warmer. And that's just pretty simple. We know that the world gets warmer and we will have more heat waves, more of them. They last longer probably, and also they are more extreme. So in particular, I wanted to talk about a paper that I wrote in 2019. So this is about what the Paris Agreement actually means for heat waves and also the consequences of heat waves in the future. So in this particular paper, I looked at the US and I've plotted the 15 places I look at in the US. So these are 15 cities in the United States that I looked at. So it's quite technical here, but all I want to show is the color. So I wanted to look at what it means if we have a world that is 1.5 degrees warmer, which is the more ambitious Paris Agreement goal. versus a world that is 2 degrees warmer, which is the second Paris Agreement goal, versus a world that is 3 degrees warmer, which at the time was the trajectory we're going towards based on our current climate policies and pledges. Not real climate policies, but the pledges the parties put into the United Nations framework. So on the left-hand side here is a map of the US plotted in pixels. That is comparing a 3 degree world versus a 1.5 degree world. So in terms of global average temperature, there's only 1.5 degrees difference in that world. But in terms of what actually means for different places in the United States, the temperature difference could be up to 3 degrees. So when we talk about global average temperature and 1.5 degree, 2 degree, whatever, what we actually experience on land and on where people live, the temperature difference is usually larger than the global average temperature. That's because we also include the oceans that warms slower when we talk about the global average. So what we experience or what the people in the US experience can be double the amount of warming in a 1.5 degree world versus a 3 degree world. If we look at the 3 degree world versus the 2 degree world, the difference is smaller because there's a smaller difference in the 2 degree and 3 degree world. And the idea is really that the higher the temperature is globally, then the more temperature difference or the more increase in temperature we'll see in where people live. And this is a case for the United States. So I then did some very technical things. So for each place, I look at what it means. I came up with those curves that I showed before in terms of what it's the mortality risk at every temperature at every city. And again, you can see that in every place, when the temperature is on this side, which is high temperatures, the mortality risk shoots up. It's different for different places because of different people and different healthcare systems and different adaptation, but it's pretty much the same kind of shape everywhere. So this is what I found for the Chicago heat wave in 1995. So in that heat wave, in real history that happened in 1995, there was over 514 deaths in that event. So I wanted to see if this same event happened, but in the future, when the world is 1 degree, 1.5 degrees warmer, or 2 degrees warmer, or 3 degrees warmer, what would the probability or the reoccurrence frequency of that event be? So I found that in a 1.5, I'll start again. In a 3 degree world, that mortality level associated with a heat wave would be very frequent, would happen every 1.5 years. So every other year or so, you expect to see that kind of mortality associated with heat in Chicago itself. When we talk about, say, in 1995, there was a particularly extreme event. In the future, if it's 3 degrees warmer, then it's pretty much an every other year event. These statistics look slightly better if we manage to adhere to the Paris Agreement and keep the world to 2 degrees warming. So the reoccurrence probability of these events would be once every 3 years on average. In a 1.5 degree world, which is like the more ambitious Paris Agreement goal, these events would still be more frequent than we would see in 1995, but it will be on average once every 5 years. So the probability of a heat wave that caused so many deaths in history will still be increased in the future because all this warming is warmer than now, but it will be less bad in a 1.5 degree world compared to, say, a 3 degree world. What's alarming is that we're kind of heading towards 3 degrees or close to it, and definitely no way near 1.5 degrees warming. Or, I mean, we are near it, but we are not near keeping to that level. So now I talk about this in a slightly different angle. So assuming that I look at an event that they're so extreme, they only happens on average once every 30 years. what would be the mortality in Chicago for that event. So if the world is following the trajectory that it was following a few years ago, in a 3-degree warming world, that is about 1,800 deaths. In a 2-degree world, that would decrease to 1,100 or so deaths in Chicago in an extreme heat wave. In a 1.5-degree world, that will be below 1,000 deaths. So we know that from the science that keeping global average temperatures below the Paris Agreement's targets will make quite a big difference in terms of what happens in a certain place when there's a heat wave in terms of human health. And we can be saving lives, literally, by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and therefore reducing our global mean temperatures. So this was the summary. So I only talked about Chicago, but I found that for all of the places, this is true. Like all of the places that I looked at in this paper, this is true, that lives could be saved if we limited global warming to 1.5 degrees compared to what we're going towards now. And in New York, for example, about 3,000 lives could be saved just from extreme heat waves if we limited global warming to 1.5 degrees versus 3 degrees. So that difference in 1 degree or 1.5 degree in the global average means a lot to what people experience on the ground in terms of temperature, and also means a lot of how many deaths we could be avoiding in terms of the mortality that would be associated with extreme heat. And this is only about extreme heat in places. It doesn't count all the other things that can affect health from climate change. So I wanted to do a similar study for Bristol. I'm afraid I don't have the particular numbers for Bath because I don't have the data there, but it's similar enough. Again, looking at what it means in terms of the mortality associated with an extreme heat wave in Bristol in different levels of warming. So historically, if we look at what happened in the past, we expect about 40 deaths per 1,000 people, 100,000 people, sorry, in an extreme heat wave. And this number increases quite a lot, quite dramatically, to 370 deaths per 100,000 in a world that's 1.5 degrees warmer. It hasn't happened yet, but we're expecting us to reach that in this century. This number, again, gets worse to 410 deaths per 100,000 people in Bristol if the world is 2 degrees warmer in the future. And again, it gets worse in a 3-degree world, about 600 deaths per 100,000. So perhaps the numbers exactly don't matter as much here as the main message that the warmer the climate gets in general, the more the people are going to die from heat waves in the US, in the UK, in Bristol, and in other places. So yeah, this is the graph that shows other places. So this is a graph from my colleague in Switzerland. Again, this is just different continents or parts of continents now, and looking at increasing mortality in different levels of warming. This one also actually shows a little bit of the decrease in cold-related deaths in the future because of a warming climate that sometimes people talk about. When we talk about climate change being a bad thing, they will say, oh, but fewer people are going to die from cold winters. So what do you think about that? So this actually shows that in some places, they don't compensate. And I don't think you can just compare people dying from cold weather versus people dying from warm weather, because it happens in different seasons. In a cold season, a lot of the illnesses and deaths are associated with seasonal flu and other factors, not just temperature itself. And also, say, if you look at South Europe, actually, the increase in heat-related mortality outweighs the decrease in cold-related mortality in the future. It's not always the same for every place, but they are not exactly the same. And also, different people can be affected by different seasons in the year. So we can't just say fewer people are going to die from cold and more people are going to die from heat, so cancels out. We can't say that. So I wanted to stress one thing, though, is that all the things I've talked about future changes in health consequences of heat waves, I've only looked at the future change in climate. I haven't considered the future change in population or the NHS in the UK or policies, adaptation or vulnerability and so on. And that's because we know that it's important, but as climate scientists, we don't know how these things will change in the future because they are too human-based. Whereas in a climate system, at least we know they follow the laws of physics. So then I want to talk about what other things will actually affect future health in terms of climate or just heat itself. So first of all, factors that will actually make things worse is an aging population. So we know that age is a risk factor for many of the health outcomes of climate change. So if we have an aging population, we will have more people who are more vulnerable to the exposures of climate. And then there's urbanization. So in terms of heat in particular, usually city centers are warmer than the surrounding rural or suburban areas because of the urban heat island effects, because of how buildings trap heat and there's not enough wind and the tarmac absorbs heat and so on. So if we continue to become more and more urbanized, which is projected to be the case in the future, then people who live in cities will have it worse and probably worse than now, which hasn't been factored in all the things I talked about before about future changes in climate. But there are also other things that we can help to reduce these risks in terms of health consequences of climate change. First of all is mitigation. So if we mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions, which is the root of the problem, then we can slow down global warming. We probably reversing it is harder because a lot of the greenhouse gases, for example, carbon dioxide, which many people talk about as a greenhouse gas, stay in the atmosphere for many, many years. So even if we achieve what they always call net zero, which is that we don't put new carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the existing carbon dioxide stayed in the atmosphere for a long time, and it will still have an effect on the climate. So we can do mitigation to slow down or even flat out the temperature change. And that is very important because it is tackling the roots of the problem. Another option, and I think it needs to go hand in hand with mitigating climate change, is to adapt to it. And previously, I don't think people talked enough about it, but now I think they increasingly realize that even at present day, even if nothing else changes, we still have heat waves, we still have floods and droughts. People are still affected by these things. So we need to have a system to adapt to the present day thing and also, build a resilient society and systems to adapt to future changes that we foresee in the future. So these two things will actually reduce the impact of climate change on health when other factors might increase them. So as a summary, I've said time and time again now that the warmer the climate becomes, the more heat-related mortality will occur. We know that with quite a lot of certainty. This will be worse in an aging society and also in society that's increasingly urbanized. Adapting to the impacts and also reducing greenhouse emissions will save lives in the future. But also the future depends on how we act now and also in the future. So I actually want to, and I haven't tested this out, to show this animation made by my colleague Seb. Right. So this is now, well, I wanted to talk about what it all means and are we actually getting there in terms of reducing global warming. So this is from a website called Climate Action Tracker. Again, it's online and you can break it down into different countries. But I'm just showing the global picture here. So basically, are the global climate policies matching with the Paris Agreement and what we agreed to try and do? So on the left-hand side here, it says real world action. So that's the blue box there. And estimated from the real world policies nowadays, we're expecting 2.7 degrees warming globally by the end. And if we also include not just what are already implemented in the world, but also the targets that various governments have put in for 2030, then we reduce that number to 2.4 degrees Celsius globally by the end of this century. So it's doing something. And then if we also include all the other pledges and targets that different governments have put into the UN, they are submitted, some of them are binding, then we can limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius if all of those are met. But the best thing is if we include all the implementation of all the announced targets and net zero targets and all the climate policies that have ever been announced by different governments, if they are all met with full optimism, then we limit the world's global temperature to about 1.8 degrees Celsius. That's the most optimistic scenario currently. It's still not meeting the more ambitious Paris Agreement's targets of 1.5. But if those, optimistically all targets, everything that's been announced are met, then that's pretty optimistic, I'll say. And now, again, we are now 1.2 degrees warming already. So this is another graph taken from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is not about temperatures anymore. This is about how much we need to cut greenhouse gases in order to meet our targets. So the wiggly black line at the beginning is the actual emissions of the world. So it increased in the past 2 decades or so. So if we talk about all the implemented policies about climate and net zero and things like that, then that's the red line that's going kind of like slightly increase and then kind of flattening out in the future if we talk about all the implemented policies. But what we need to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius is that green line, is that drop in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what we have implemented now is no way near that. We need a massive cut in greenhouse gas emissions. And the blue line shows what we need to achieve a 1.5 degree world, which is the more ambitious Paris Agreement's target. And again, we need deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, not in the future, but right now. We need that massive, drastic decrease starting now to get to that target. And again, that target is still warmer than the present day, so more consequences then, but it's better than anything else. So in the UK, how are we doing? This came from 2 days ago. It was on the news. So the Climate Change Committee is the independent advisor to the UK government about climate change in this country. So they publish these things called progress reports, tracking how the government is doing in terms of adaptation and mitigation in greenhouse gases and so on. So the latest one just came out 2 days ago. And the key words were that there was a lack of urgency. There were immediate priority actions and policies needed for the UK. And the UK needs to retake a clear leadership role internationally, because I think the committee thinks that we've fallen slightly, below our level at COP26 in terms of global leadership in climate change. And I think this was based on the government agreeing on new coal mines and so on, and new runways in airports and so on. So this doesn't look great. Again, this is the independent advisor for the UK government. They are obliged to actually produce a report about the climate risks and also how the UK is doing here. And the honest answer is that they think a lot more is needed for the UK, and also globally as well, because we know that even in the global picture, even with all the climate pledges and targets that have already been announced, we are not meeting the 1.5 degree warming targets in the Paris Agreement. So I just wanted to end with this question: what future, which of the animations do we want to have for our future generations and kids who aren't even born yet? And that future depends on what we do now in terms of how we adapt our society, and also how we take leadership in climate policy to drastically reduce greenhouse gases. And I personally would choose the future that's less warm and have less consequences in terms of extreme events, devastating to health and other things. And I haven't even touched on many things, including when there's not enough resources, there could be conflicts that will lead to mass migration and wars, for example. And those are things that are kind of cascading impacts of climate change that I haven't had time to talk about. But what climate future do we want depends on what we do right now. So I'll end here. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Eunice.
Thank you.
And we got the technology working thanks to Ollie. So thank you, Ollie, if you're listening. So that's good. So thank you very much indeed. I mean, so many questions, both online and I'm sure in the room. But before we get to the questions, we go back to our poll. So get your phones ready online and in the room. And we'll rerun the same questions again and see what we end up with. So let me just go to the first one. Okay, so the first question. Climate change is the biggest threat to humanity in 2050. Agree or disagree? So remember early on, this was slightly, I wouldn't say it was balanced, but I think it seems here that more of us feel that this is an issue, not just in 2050, but something that we need to deal with now. So I'm going to go on to the next question. So it's pretty conclusive. Bit of musical entertainment. Good. The next question is, in 2050, climate change will be solved, a bigger problem, or under control? I think last time at the beginning, none of us thought it was solved, but a few more thought it was under control. So Eunice has done a fantastic job to create the burning platform for us.
I'm sorry.
So that's definitely clear, and it's a bit of a change. And then finally, there you go. Climate change is best solved through individual change, government action, corporates taking responsibility, or global policy agreement. Okay. Interesting. Very interesting. We still don't have any individual responsibility. It's not us, somebody else. It's the corporates. Mainly, a tiny bit of corporates, but mainly it's governments and basically the global community as a whole. So I think we'll draw that to a conclusion. I think that's again is pretty compelling. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the share now, and we get on to the Q&A session. Let's just go to the view as well and go to gallery. Okay, so we've got people online now on the, why are we on the screen? We need to get rid of something else, I think. Ollie, you might be required again. We definitely need to get rid of this one.
It's showing again.
Yeah, and it's gone here. That's interesting.
I think it's on the different screens, so if you drag.
Well, if you can get rid of the thing, so we can actually show this screen on the. Yeah, let's get rid of these. slider can be done, that's fine. Yeah, close that off and then just need to go back. There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much, Ollie. Applause for Ollie, please. Okay, we now get to the Q&A session. So I'm going to start with the room. Climate change 2050. Who's got some questions? Who wants to go first? The gentleman in the front row, that's very convenient. If you could speak directly into the microphone.
Eunice, that was very interesting, and the work you've done in your PhD, congratulations. I was particularly interested in you identifying death rates in individual American cities, USA cities. And I'm wondering what impact that's had on any aspects of USA politics, culture. What difference do you feel is it making to help fight climate crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Thank you for asking that. So that paper was published in 2019 when actually the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement. And that paper was showing that, how many people in your country will die if we don't meet the Paris Agreement. So that was an interesting time. They have now rejoined because of a different administration. That paper got a lot of media attention, definitely, both in the US and the UK. So that was great for my career. But also a lot more people, knew about the impacts of climate change on their particular place. And I've given a similar talk highlighting those results in different places. And people did come to me and say, this is really hitting home because, my grandma lives in Detroit and, she's vulnerable there, and you showing, the mortality impacts in that particular place she lives in. So linking the physical climate to the impacts definitely have a lot more attention from people because it's relatable. In terms of policy, though, I don't think a single paper affects policy that much because these papers and results, even mentioned in the news, are pretty much still in the sphere of academics, and it gets included as a line in a report somewhere. But then in general, I think governments know what climate change is and what's needed to solve them. Whether they do it or not is another issue. And I don't think any particular scientific output that I've produced has really seen that direct impact of I found this and therefore, do this. I don't think that's happened in my relatively short career so far.
But there's definitely a difference between science and politicians. I remember the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 suggested we need to decrease greenhouse gases by 40% by 2010. Instead, we increased them by 20%. So there's a big gap between what the science tells us and what we actually end up doing. Anybody else in the room?
Hi, I think we've established that as individuals, there's not a lot we can do. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and I think I agree with, is trying to keep this balance between worrying people that there's nothing they can do and getting them motivated enough to do something. But I guess the answer is, what do we do? We've got Just Stop Oil, and they're, causing havoc and upsetting some people, but getting a message across. It just is. I mean, I guess most of us in this room are from the generation that are used to going out on demonstrations and actually having an impact. But this is so huge. It's beyond our government. It's beyond us. So I don't know whether you've thought about this, because obviously you're a scientist rather than a politician. But have you any thoughts what it is we can actually do?
I don't think it's a problem beyond governments. I think if governments did actually all act together and in collaboration across the world, this could be something that, if not solved, be more under control. And as Andreas was saying, we have known about the problem of climate change and the science for decades. That's even, before I was born, scientists were doing research like this and talking to governments. So solutions are also out there in terms of shifting massively to renewables, changing our lifestyles, taxing companies when they produce greenhouse gases. There's a lot to be done, both in the private world and the policy world. But I think it's that there's often potentially a lack of motivation, because climate change is more long-term than a political cycle, and potentially short-term economy is more important to some people than the long-term consequences. But we know that in the long term, all the consequences added up from climate change definitely cost us a lot more money than just solving it or reducing it right now. So I don't think it's beyond human possibility of in terms of controlling this problem. I think there's need to be will to do it, and the hope would be that there's a worldwide coordination and collaboration in this, and also in terms of richer nations helping out nations that may not have the resources or didn't really cause the problem in solving this. And as individuals, then I have a lot of hope in the younger generation when they go out and protest, on Fridays. I think they are a lot more concerned about this problem than all the rest of us, and I think that's hopeful. And also when individually, and I know none of us put individual behavior change as the solution to the problem, but in addition to all the massive policy change globally and nationally, individually we can add up in terms of our actions, and potentially the most important one is to elect people who will solve the problems or have the will to do that.
Okay, we've got another question in the room, and then I go to some online ones.
I was going to start by saying I want to talk about both and, but before that, I just want to come back on what you said about age. I think there's fairly good evidence that shows that people across the age ranges care in roughly equal proportions about this. You ask a grandparent if they care about their grandchildren who will be alive in the year 2100. My grandson will be. And as I say, I think the research supports that. But the both and comment I was going to make is actually almost a three-part one. It's absolutely essential that the political will is turned into action. And we quite often categorize business as a problem. And that mix of the political setting enabling and encouraging the business and commercial action to level up the playing field and create settings in which doing the right thing is also the right thing for the bottom line and so on. It's absolutely essential. But I think the both and is that the other bit is that individual action is still required. So, if people will go off and take multiple short flight holidays, several times a year and so on, they are part of the problem. There's a good scheme in Bath called Eco Together, which is a little program where groups of people can come together and work through a little work package. And the first of the sessions within that looks at the power that people have. The power you have as a consumer, the power you have as an advocate, and the power of your voice and so on. And then takes further sessions where you look at what does that mean in terms of how you use energy, how you shop for food and things like that. And it is proving very effective in individual change. So I think it's both and. Apologies.
No, that's fine.
That's
so
great.
Basically the summary of this is everybody has to pull their weight, whether it's the individuals, whether it's the companies, or it's government policy.
Yeah, and you can individually, you can then drive a bigger change on a massive scale, because, the companies need to listen to what consumers like to, eat in terms of, how many people eat meat or so on. And also, consumer needs and what the public thinks. are important to companies and governments as well. So I agree, it's on all levels we need to act. And I'm particularly inspired by the community-led projects that are happening across the UK and other places.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions online now. One is from Yvonne. Does the speaker correlate higher migratory rates to cooler places to live due to warming climate and health issues in the future? Is there any research on this subject?
So there's research on this subject. I think it's less about, it's more about migration of people and, extreme climates and maybe droughts and so on drive people away from their home because they don't have resources or they can't live in those places anymore. That's not my personal research, but there are researchers looking at that, and we know that could be a huge problem in the future as well. So if places or governments think like immigration is a problem now to certain places, then they really need to think about what climate change means in the future.
Okay. So there's a few people want to have some opinions from you, Eunice. Mm-hmm. What is the realistic average global temperature increase in 2050 and then in 2100? What do you think?
Oh, that's
so. You showed us the optimistic,
yeah,
which you more or less discounted, I think, and then you showed us the most pessimistic. So where do you think we're going to be in 2050, in your opinion, and where we're going to be in 2100?
So I don't know is the answer. I can't have an exact. I'm a scientist, so I need to have like the exact number with associated with some level of certainty when I say any number. So I don't have an answer off the top of my head, but I personally think meeting the 1.5 degree targets in the Paris Agreement is super ambitious in terms of where we're heading right now. It's just very ambitious. So I wouldn't say there's no chance, and I don't want to be very alarmist, but our window of opportunity is really closing fast. Yeah. And mid-century, we will have, less warming than in the future, I hope. But yeah, I wouldn't have a number exactly, but some of the warming we see in the next decades or so is partly decided by what greenhouse gases are already in the atmosphere right now. So the divergence of those different scenarios will be seen towards the end of the century rather than like in the next few years, because there's a memory in the system.
Okay, another question by Debbie is, Eunice, what do you think is the best way for us to tackle climate change? And I assume that means at an individual level rather than at a global level.
So yeah, what we just discussed just now in terms of cutting our own carbon footprints, and that really depends on the individual. So if you drive a car that's like highly polluting, then maybe that's the way to like switch to a more environmentally friendly vehicle, or not drive at all. Take less flights, especially the short haul ones. There are other options like trains to Europe and so on, and those are better options than taking the flights. I think advocating the cause of tackling climate change to other people as well. So obviously people who come to these talks are people who are interested in climate change, but there are other people who never come to these talks and thinks these are, nonsense and there's no change in climate and it's not a problem at all. So talking with people, potentially using some of the climate strikes to start a conversation as well, is a great way to make sure that everybody gets the message about climate change and what needs to be done, because it needs collective efforts, by all individuals to solve this problem.
Okay, well, we've got time for one more question. Does anybody in the room want to ask one question? Okay, so that's fine. This will be the last question, and then we're going to wrap up. So please keep the question short.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. You mentioned mental health, and I wonder if you know of any research into the effects of, long-term effects of climate change on mental health and what we might expect.
Yeah. So first of all, there are multiple ways that climate change affects mental health. Some people worry about it to an extent that it isn't manageable. We do know that, say, for example, there's an extreme event, such as a heat wave or something, domestic violence increase. So health is affected through that way. And also in the long term, this is definitely out of my expertise. But I know researchers who are looking at long-term exposure to climate change and also air quality and how it affects dementia and other cognitive functions as well. So many people are looking more and more into the mental aspect of climate change, in addition to the physical ones.
Okay. Well, listen, this has been an excellent evening. Thank you very much,
Thank
Eunice,
you
for everything that you've presented. Please put your hands together for you.